Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome regular contributor, Representative Emily Kornheiser from her newly painted office at her house. Hello, Emily.
Hello, Olga. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. And I like your hair, and your top is very well coordinated with the furniture in the background.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you.
See, things are coming together.
Whenever I change my shirt, I change my furniture.
Okay, I want to see you in a multicolored tie-dye next time and see what happens with your furniture.
You will never see that, Olga. Never.
I also want to welcome to the show Doug Hoffer, who is the State Auditor, and we are here to talk about hazard mitigation and an audit his office recently did. Doug, I know we've had you on the show before. Very glad to have you back. But I still think a lot of folks don't really know what your office does. So
we like it that way.
You're in stealth mode.
Yeah. I'm happy to give you the overview. I suspect it's not what most people think. They assume we do financial auditing, which of course is a very important element of our mission, but we farm that out to a contractor to do the annual audit of the state's financial statements, which is a big deal, just a little boring for my taste. The other major undertaking annually is the so-called federal single audit, which is a compliance audit of all the federal money and the programs that it supports. Which leaves us free to do the one thing that is of most interest to me, and I think of most value to the state, which is performance auditing. We look at programs and agencies to ensure, or try to find out, I should say, the extent to which they are achieving the goals intended by the legislature, which funds them and created those programs. Some are federal, but most are state. And that really is the bottom line. What are we getting for the money? Is state government efficient and effective, and so forth? So that's what we do.
Thank you, Doug.
Well, we upset people sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes we don't like it when our systems get challenged because we always assume they work until someone tells us they don't, and then we don't want to hear it. It's right. Very human. Yeah. Well, for those who don't know, Doug's office sends out a newsletter from time to time when they have something they want to share. And what caught my eye this time around was your audit of the hazard mitigation plan that the state has, the overall hazard mitigation plan that is supposed to sort of look at all the possible hazards and things that could go wrong, and then how are we going to address them plan. And it caught my eye because, of course, we have had a number of hazards sweep through the state, from a pandemic to multiple floods. And so that's what caught my eye. And I think what also caught my eye, Doug, was how often when your office does an audit, you then talk to the department that you did the audit on and say, hey, here's our recommendations. What do you think? And sometimes it's crickets. But I was impressed that Vermont Emergency Management said, yeah, we agree with what you're saying. At least that's what your newsletter said. So I found that heartening.
Well, that's not exactly the case, but it's close.
Okay. Was I putting a rosier shine on it than perhaps there was?
No, actually, it wasn't the Vermont Emergency Management Office, which is situated, for the record, within the Department of Public Safety. Their position is that when we reported that many of the projects identified in the 2018 plan, we'll get into this, but it's every 5 years, only a third of them were actually completed. They said, well, the plan is only aspirational. And I said, okay, that's your story, and you're sticking to it. So what you're referring to, Olga, was a letter which we request each time from the management in response to our conclusions and recommendations. And the commissioner of the Department of Public Safety actually said, thank you for the work. We get it. We can do better, and we will. And that's the best response, because then the media doesn't have a fight. And if there's no fight, they're less likely to make a big deal out of it. So smart bureaucrats, that's what they do when they get an audit report. But some just can't help themselves. And we'll talk about one later where they just say, you're full of it.
Well, thank you for that clarity, Doug. I appreciate it. So let's step back a little bit and talk about what brought you to even want to do this audit.
Well, it's hard to ignore. As you said, we collectively, the state and the region and the country and the world have had a lot of these incidents that are out of the ordinary and extraordinary. So, for example, after the July flood, our offices are situated on State Street in a little old Victorian building, which has a lot of issues, but also has a lot of character, and is one of 3 remaining older buildings on that end of State Street, which I think adds a lot to the town. Nevertheless, it's in the floodway, and the building was flooded. Now, we had many years ago, BGS, the Buildings and General Services folks, had removed most everything from the basement. Not literally everything. There was still some wiring and a few things. So the flooding didn't really, endanger the structural integrity of the building, but the water came up far enough that the people who do this work said everything's got to go. Not because some wet things can't be cleaned. I mean, I was outraged, frankly, the stuff they threw away. Virtually everything on the first floor of our building had to be disposed of. And I thought, well, the legs of a metal table, give me a break, can be cleaned. No, everything's got to go. So I think that just made it easier for them. In any case, we have been out of that building for over a year. And as far as I know, the administration has not yet made a decision, and therefore clearly has not prioritized the resolution of our building. And I don't think that's a result of our nasty Graham audit reports, but I think they're trying to figure out what to do with those 3 buildings. I have an idea about it, which has nothing to do with the audit, but there are some companies in Vermont, I'm sure you both know this, that make their living lifting buildings.
Mm-hmm.
It's really quite remarkable, the engineering skill and equipment necessary to do that. But if they were to raise our building 2 feet, change the landscaping, done. But I think there are those who would like to see the state tear those buildings down and build some other hideous building like the one down the street that has DMV in it, as a matter of fact. In any case, it was pretty hard to ignore this issue, the broader issue of, my goodness, what's happening here. And Montpelier was severely impacted, as was Barry and some other places. So one of my senior auditors just got curious and looked into it and came back to me and my deputy and said, there may be a job here. We can find out, how well are they doing? And it's not, to be clear to your listeners or viewers, I guess, it's not necessarily what they do after a disaster. It's in preparation, although it's not always about, we can't stop climate change. So we can't, there's little we can do other than the climate change efforts that the state is doing, which are part of a global effort. But we can't stop the flooding in the short term. But there are some things we can do to make the impacts less troublesome for us, for people and property. That's more like what hazard mitigation is.
So, Emily, I'm wondering, at the State House level, has there been conversations around hazard mitigation? What's sort of the landscape looking like from your perspective?
I mean, even stepping back from that, I think this issue that Doug raised and this conversation about like a plan is aspirational, or this is sort of required and it happens to some degree sometimes, and then there's an emergency, the emergency is responded to, but the lessons are not learned from the emergency. We're seeing that all over state government right now. And I think similar in some ways to the auditor's frustration where, Doug, your job is to audit and report on stuff that's not working right or is working, but you have no power necessarily to enforce anything coming from that. I'm feeling really, and I know a lot of my colleagues are feeling really stuck in this situation of like, we pass legislation with very clear intent, and then it is not carried out. And sometimes that is because the administration doesn't want to carry it out. And sometimes that's because state government has been stripped to such an unbelievably frayed capacity that folks just really can't, they don't have enough work hours.
Mhm.
And we see that the effects of that are like differently terrible and vibrant in different areas. So like everything related to emergency housing right now, I think is a great example of that. And there's huge suffering there and huge cost to the state. And similarly, I think hazard mitigation is one of those places where if not done robustly during the sort of off crisis, we see unbelievable suffering and really high costs. I know that down here in Windham County, you know, each district is supposed to have its own plan. And in Windham County, there was a really robust sort of response to Irene and post response to Irene, where a group really came together and said, let's be prepared if this happens again, with a comprehensive hazard mitigation plan. COVID came, and that same group came together and actually adapted it to a pandemic, and then have said, okay, like we had one for flooding and we had one for a pandemic. Those are two really different things. What's the next crisis? What are we going to do next? And do not have the capacity to do sort of that next level of planning, because everyone's doing it as like 1% or 0.01% of their jobs, right? And it's not anyone's job to actually be thinking about this all the time.
Correct.
And when we like look at the expenses in the like, you know, of this flood last year and then the flood this summer, and we're not building in, again, we're sort of just like meeting the challenge and not building resilient communities for the next one. The administration did this like wild planning exercise in Barrie, and everyone's like, why are you just doing that in one place? What's going to come of it? Just because like you're from there doesn't mean you get to like pick your favorite town buddy. And I'm like really on fire today. This is really like, I'm not usually quite this rude about the governor, excuse me. And
the views and opinions.
yes. And like nothing's come of that either. And some of that is that like Vermonters in a lot of cases like don't really want anything, aren't willing to make the like live the tough, to make the balance between either you have like the tough changes in your life that hazard mitigation might cause, like the beautiful building goes away, or the unbelievable expense of keeping the beautiful building or working collaboratively, right? And so like we've talked before about sort of like upstream and downstream and all these different contexts, but anyway, I will stop talking there. But that's I think the tough decisions either of spending more or like significantly shifting our behaviors is really, I think we get stuck there, and no one wants to be the jerk face who points that out.
Well, clearly you do, and thank you for that. But
and you do have a beautiful, I mean, your office is in a beautiful building, Doug.
Yeah, it is. And it's got a lot of character, and there's, you know, there isn't much character left at that end of the street. There's a couple of nice buildings, but I would hate to lose those three old, smallish frame buildings. They're nice.
Well, and I'll jump in too and say, you know, that choice of, do you raise the Victorian house so the foundations are higher than the flood level, or tear it down, build something new? In some ways, it's a moot decision if whoever is making the decisions isn't willing, as Emily said, to think about hazard mitigation. Because if you tear down the Victorian, put another thing in its place, but still put all the electrics in the basement and the heating system in the basement and keep it at flood level, guess what? You're still going to have the same problem. It's just on a different building.
Well, Emily will appreciate this. I think yesterday I spent a couple of hours in a meeting of the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee, and oddly, my computer wasn't working properly, so they couldn't see me. So I just had a picture of falling water up there. But they did discuss in the context of, well, what are our needs? What are our capital needs? Which they do in part because me and a couple of other people yell at them about it. You can't just pick a number. It's got to reflect something. So we did discuss the 10-year capital plan and the last biennial plan, and it didn't include anything for my building, gosh darn it. But they did acknowledge that they're going to address as best they can this question that you raised, Olga, about relocating wiring and that sort of thing in the buildings that are not going to be destroyed. So they're just not moving as quickly off the mark. And to something that Emily said, I think your characterization of it was spot on. People have to make changes in our lifestyles and the way we do business, but it's also clearly about money. And the reason that this plan that we audited and the extent to which the actions included were completed or not is important is not because this or a previous administration said, let's have a plan. It's because FEMA requires us to have a plan. You can't get money from FEMA in response to natural disasters if you don't have an approved plan. It's done every 5 years. So when we started the job, we actually heard from some people in the administration, don't upset FEMA.
I've heard that before too.
Yeah, sorry, that's not my job to worry about FEMA. The point is, we came to learn that FEMA itself doesn't really devote the resources necessary to determine whether states actually implement the projects in their plans, which is really too bad. Although they did learn about our audit report and asked for a copy, so who knows what might come of this. But as to the money, back to the money, it's a problem because all governors, understandably, and mayors love to have somebody else pay for things. In this case, the federal government, and we do it when there's disasters all over the country, and that's fine. But for example, one clearly successful and appropriate response to flooding is to identify buildings that are in the floodway and have been damaged more than once or twice, likely to be damaged again, and it's just not sustainable. Buy them, destroy them, remove them. Well, we did a little bit of that until the federal money ran out, and now we don't have a designated source for additional funds to keep doing what is clearly one of the most effective things that we can do for flooding, just that one type of disaster. So it's really the state. I mean, in my view, this governor is reluctant to raise money. I mean, he said that from the day he was elected.
Yeah, I don't think that's in your view. I think that's just straight.
Yeah, I think many a newspaper article probably has a quote from him on that.
Yeah. So, but there are actual implications to that policy. I mean, and this won't surprise you, but we do audits of various agencies, departments, programs, and it's not uncommon to hear people say, we're trying to do better, but we don't have enough resources. So we then say, did you ask for more? And on many occasions, they say, no, they discourage that. So it's a problem. And of course, people don't want their taxes raised. So there's a lot of moving parts, and it's all a challenge. But it's clear in this case that, as far as we can tell, the administration and its predecessor did not take this seriously. They had the plan done, sufficient to satisfy FEMA, which is a start, and they engaged with subject area experts who were smart and made good recommendations about projects that could make a difference. But if you don't fund them or do them, and back to your point, Emily, about how does a locality benefit from the state work when you guys don't have the resources to do it yourself? Here's an example of one that was intended to do just that. One of the recommendations from 2018 was that the state should develop and publish model building codes for every town in the state. Now, obviously, you know better than I, Emily, that the legislature is reluctant to force localities to do things, but this would have said, we did the hard work, adopt it, some of it, all of it, but here it is. They didn't bother to do that. Now, admittedly, doing that stuff takes time, not creating the building codes, because that exists, but getting towns to go through the process to adopt them. There's always competing interests and all that, but they didn't do any of that. And that's the easy stuff. So it was really quite frustrating. So I don't buy this suggestion that it's possible. Some of these recommendations were perfectly reasonable and could have been done even during COVID, which some would say was a barrier to getting a lot of things done. I don't think so.
Can we backtrack just like
just
a minute?
ray of sunshine?
Can we backtrack just a minute and just explain like what a hazard mitigation plan is and what it's supposed to accomplish?
Well, there are, as you know, as we all know, different types of natural disasters. We've experienced a lot of flooding. Other parts of the country experienced tornadoes or hurricanes or earthquakes. Some parts of the country are more prone to excessive heat. even us. I mean, for New England, it's getting hotter. So the idea is to identify the dozen or 15 types of hazards that we can write down, prioritize them, because, let's be real, hail is not likely to be a major problem in Vermont, but in other parts of the country, it has been and can be. So once you identify them, then you say, okay, well, what can we do? What does the best science and engineering and public policy give us as tools to anticipate and then take actions that will reduce, therefore mitigate the damage from this? And that's what they do. And the last plan had almost 100 actions, and they only completed about a third of them. They also prioritized the actions, and a little more than half of those were completed. That's it.
Hmm.
Now, there's also a committee, a planning and a policy and planning committee, which is comprised of the secretaries and commissioners of all the major relevant agencies and departments, and they are supposed to review the process of the implementation of the plan over time, and also find a way, to the extent possible, to measure the effectiveness of the projects that are implemented. And they didn't do either one of those. Now, these are busy people. I'm certain that they didn't get together for a beer and say, we don't really care about that. The heck with it. Let's move on. They're just busy people, and somebody above them didn't make it a priority. The person above them is the governor's office. FEMA requires that this plan be signed, literally signed, by the person closest to the governor, in this case, the Secretary of Administration. Now, I don't want to call out Sarah Clark, who's the acting secretary, and I've known her a while. She's very capable. She had nothing to do with any of this. She just took the job a little while ago. But it's the people over time in that position who ultimately are at the top of that hierarchy who should have said, hey, this is our responsibility. And the Secretary of Administration has people working for him or her that can keep a list of things. Today's this day. Today's emergency management. Well, they just didn't do that.
I want to echo that, Doug, because in my previous work life, I worked for an organization that shall go unnamed, that had to do hazard mitigation planning, but it also had to do emergency response planning. And if people are wondering kind of what's the difference, think of mitigation as preventative medicine, and then the hazard response plan as the emergency room, where you go what you do when all hell breaks loose. And it was an organization.
That was a lovely comparison. Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to say, like, on point there, Olga.
Why, thank you.
Yeah.
Why, thank you.
That's why they pay her the big bucks.
And in this particular organization, there wasn't buy-in from the management staff, the administrative staff, the top tier, in part because, like you said, they were busy. But I was working with the safety person, and this person would hold drills as they were required to do, because of the type of organization. And it also happened to be within the Vermont Yankee was still open, the nuclear plant. And so it was in the zone. So it also had to do planning around that. And the safety person would hold drills and trainings, and no one from the administration would show up. Like, they just would not show up. They wouldn't even send a surrogate. And the problem is once we did have a problem once that needed to be responded to, and they didn't know what to do. Luckily, other staff were able to step in, but it would make my head explode. And the problem is then people don't get their needs met, or people aren't safe during an emergency. And
furthermore, then they lose faith in government.
Very good point. Yep. Perfect point. So I just want to echo that from kind of a real life experience of how it will bite you in the bum. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, it's unfortunate, but I was, back to the earlier comment, I was pleased that the administration, the commissioner, acknowledged the problem and promised to do better, and I hope they do. And as I've said before to you, Emily knows this, usually a year or so out from the issuance of the audit report, we go back for a recommendation follow-up to find out what, if anything, they've done in response to our recommendations. So we will be reporting on this later.
I look forward to hearing what they say, and what has or has not happened. Because, disasters will happen.
Funny about that.
It's what you do after them and what you learn is kind of the important part. Emily, we have a few minutes before the end of this first half. What are you sitting with right now?
I mean, honestly, like a little while ago, Doug apologized for being a bummer. I'm just, honestly, this week I'm feeling really overwhelmed by how frayed all of our systems are. And this is just another one of them that's essential, along with our hospital system and our school system. And yeah, it seems like it's a tiny state and it should be possible for us to plan and prevent disasters, especially, something like a flood that we know is coming over and over again.
Even the ones that are slow moving, like the incredible never ending increase in medical costs.
Yeah. And I feel like, let's talk about that let's talk about medical costs after the break. I'm really struck by the struggles and sort of where the locus of decision-making is in a lot of these things.
Yeah.
The state, if it was doing its job well, which I don't think it is in this case, could create models, could create plans, can't really mandate, could mandate. Municipalities have no capacity to do any of this. And yet it's left to them. Also, like, hazards generally don't stick to town boundaries. And so why are we doing that at the town level? So yeah, before we go to a break, I just say, I think we can do better, Vermont.
I think what I'm sitting with, we have such a proactive state. Like, we often tell the story of Vermonters that after a disaster, how they just kind of muck in and get things done. But eventually that will become exhausted too. So at the bare minimum, we want to support our people who are doing the work. The other thing I think I'm hearing in this conversation, Emily, you used the term how frayed our systems are. I think what I'm feeling in this conversation is where the bottlenecks are, where things are getting stuck and not moving forward. And yes, I agree. A lot of systems are frayed, but yeah, I'm just feeling a lot of bottlenecks in the top-down system. Think thoughts, Doug, before we go to break?
Yeah, I think the bottlenecks are the administration and the legislature.
I think the bottleneck's you, Doug.
Oh boy. Okay, on that note, we're going to keep looking for the bottlenecks, but we're going to have you lovely listeners hear from some of our underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. So stay tuned. We will be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, our community radio station. I'm the host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and if you're just joining us, I'm speaking with regular contributor, Representative Emily Kornheiser from Brattleboro, and State Auditor Doug Hoffer. We were talking in the first half of the show about hazard mitigation plans and a recent audit that the office did, and now we're going to move on to some other things that both Emily and Doug have been working on separately, but shared interests. And yes, I have to thank BCTV for taking the video version of the show, sharing it with PEG stations around the state. And Emily, what do we need to remind listeners of?
The views and opinions, especially today, expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, respectively, not their employer, spouse, pets.
You can't slip in anything from your spouse? Come on.
Mm-mm. Well, you can, but the opinion still belongs to them. So, fine line there, Doug.
Or the platform or station. I think I left that first part out, which is the important part. That's actually why I have to say it. The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour, those of the host and the guest, respectively, and not the station or platform that is broadcasting the information.
Mm-hmm. You know, I have been watching a TV show lately out of the UK, and it has to do with farming because I'm a nerd. Uh, but of course, during this show, they've been running into all the red tape that exists in the UK around farming, and this was before Brexit. And so there's also red tape from the EU. And I was laughing because I was like, you know, it's a lot of red tape, but I get the sense that the red tape is there for true kind of health and safety worries. Where in the US, we have all this red tape, but usually it's just because no one wants to get sued or have to take responsibility for anything. So that was my negative thought last night as I was watching this farming show out of the UK.
That liability is for losers, you know.
That might be the title of this episode, maybe. So Doug, talk to us a little bit about what else you've been working on. Where would you like to start? You have a number of things in the works.
We do, but healthcare is such a big deal. I'll go back to it because Emily had mentioned it either before or during the break. And we had some interesting decisions by the Green Mountain Care Board recently that arguably are a step in the right direction. I don't think anyone would deny that. One was a decision about the hospital, I say the hospital, University of Vermont Medical Center. I live in Chittenden County, and there had been an application from them for what's called a certificate of need to build another outpatient facility for surgery, which is really kind of interesting because a couple of private interests have tried to do that over the years and never gotten anywhere because the hospital always fought against them. But that's just the desire not to have competition. In any case, in the decision, which was a yes, the board did agree to let them do this, but they did something very interesting. They said, you can't charge more than a certain amount for surgeries or procedures conducted on at this facility. And to my knowledge, they've never done that before, and they do have that authority in statute. And me and others have been waiting breathlessly for them to use that authority. And they did, which is a great start. I wouldn't be surprised if the University of Vermont Medical Center sues them or appeals their decision, but that's one. The other is they have just gone through the hospital budget process, which they do every year. And in the case, again, of the University of Vermont Medical Center, they really took in a lot more money last year than they anticipated. More people, more procedures, that's their story. I'm not sure what the actual answer is, but that's what they say. And it wasn't insubstantial, it was about $80 million. So they asked for the usual fairly enormous annual increase in revenue, net patient revenue. And the board said, gosh, you've got this $80 million. Why shouldn't we include that in our calculus, thinking about how much we should give you as an increase?
That seems
They said,
reasonable.
oh, no, pshaw, you can't do that. In the end, that's exactly what the board did and told them, you ready? To reduce their net patient revenue because they have access to and are sitting on this $80 million. So that was, again, I wouldn't be surprised if the hospital challenges that as well. But they also did something great for all of the other hospitals whose budgets are reviewed and approved. The board has for many years had a target. They said, we don't want hospital costs to go up more than 3.5% a year. And that came from some silly, simple arithmetic in Maryland that has nothing to do with whether we can all afford that much of an increase every year. But that's what they said. And they never really abided by that. They'd give them 6, 8, 10, 12. This year, they did it. They approved hospital budgets for the other hospitals, not University of Vermont Medical Center, for 3.4%. Now, you could argue we still can't afford that because the foundation on which the 3.4 is built is so much bigger than it would have been had they stuck to 3.5 for the last 10 years. In any case, they did it, which is, to my knowledge, the first time they've ever really done that across the board. So I'm encouraged by this, and I don't know where it's going to go. I'm sure Emily has some thoughts on this, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
Interesting. What are your thoughts, Emily?
I think it's a similar situation about how we're often not willing to make the tough choices to get what we want. So we can't decide if we want like a fully regulated healthcare system or a non-regulated healthcare system. And so we wind up in this half-regulated healthcare system that creates a lot of red tape that works sometimes and doesn't work other times. We have this recent report from about hospital systems to lower healthcare costs. And that will mean like really significantly changing how people experience healthcare in the state of Vermont. And like, are we willing to do that in order to get quality care, right? Quality, affordable care. But it's change, and we hate change so much in this state. Yeah, and I just feel sort of sad about that. And it's, what I think is interesting about it is I think most Vermonters with resources are already behaving the way they would if we significantly changed our system. And it's folks without resources that aren't. And yet the people with resources are the ones who are sort of controlling the conversation. I don't know. I'm probably not explaining that as well as I could, but
is there an example you could give that would
yeah,
just...
so most people with resources, let's say they got cancer or Parkinson's or high-risk birth, they would probably seek care, like in Brattleboro, they would seek care in Boston or Dartmouth. Anywhere in the northern part of the state, they would seek care at, UVM Medical Center. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I keep on remembering that it was red. I'm like, maybe it's the Leahy Medical Center. Who knows? And
I still call it Fletcher Allen.
yes, yeah, that's what I like. I was about to say Fletcher. I had kept on switching back and forth, and I was like, which one's the old one? Which one's the new one? And folks who with less resources, like sort of settle for their local hospital for those kinds of treatment, because the transportation costs and the logistics, and also just like the psychological privilege of thinking that there's like a better, more qualified option somewhere further, right? Like, I'm going to seek the best care rather than the care that's available. Like that sort of thinking comes from a certain frame and life experience. And I think the care, like the type of care that happens, the preventative care that's really invested in with global budgeting and reference-based pricing and all of those things requires people to behave like individuals in the system to behave in a certain way. The hospitals can't just change their behavior. The actual people experiencing healthcare also need to change their behavior. And I don't know if we're ready to support that kind of behavior change. And I don't know if the Green Mountain Care Board and the Agency of Human Services and the hospitals that have like pretty significantly competing interests from each other are ever going to be willing to collaborate in order to make sure that like Vermonters can just get the healthcare they need.
Well, they might collaborate better with, to be very honest, a different governor. This
Sure.
governor ran initially talking a lot about healthcare, but hasn't made it a priority during his tenure, which is too bad.
Yep.
Although to his credit, he appointed and is likely to reappoint the chair and at least one or two of the other members who are helping to redirect the board's attention. So.
Interesting. I don't know if either of you can answer this question, but when it comes, I think a lot of people would feel healthcare costs, especially insurance costs, keep rising. Every municipal budget meeting I cover, you hear insurance went up again this year, insurance went up again this year. So how much, the other thing about Vermont is, to your point, Emily, about how we find ourselves sometimes in this middle ground between different systems. we're also an individual state, but we're part of a larger US system as well. How much of these healthcare decisions are ours to make? How much are they outside pressures? Like, what can we actually expect to change if we are kind of in this dual state and national environment? Like, does that make sense what I'm trying to?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think a lot can be done, even though there are, uh, you know, powerful national interests and systems. We're spending $7 billion a year on healthcare. The rest of New England is spending multiples of that. There's no reason. We have the legal authority. The hospitals wouldn't like to admit that, but we could do whatever we want as a people. This is our community. It doesn't have to be a free for all. There are some ways in which capitalism doesn't work. And there isn't, in Vermont in particular, there's just not a lot of competition, which is part of the problem. We're, a rural state. Each little part of the state wants to have its own hospital that does everything, and that's not realistic and blah, blah, blah. But I don't think there's any barrier technically or legally. It's the politics. Do we have the will? I mean, Emily has said it now several times. Are Vermonters ready to accept the need for and actually do the change in their own lives and in their communities that's required? And we're not getting the leadership on having that conversation.
Mhm. Emily, can you give us some examples of individual behavior that might have to change?
So there's like this whole assumption about global budgeting and reference base, like all of it, that people engage in preventative healthcare, like if it's available to them and if it's affordable and accessible to them, rather than like repeated emergency care, right? And that people have the resources to get to sort of the best possible care that they need. And most Vermonters that I know, like it's one of the sort of the more rural aspects of our character here, that like people don't like doctors, don't trust doctors, and don't want to go access healthcare unless they need to. And part of it, I think we assume that's because of cost, but it's a lifetime of worrying about cost. And at this time, it's totally separate from like the cost or the not cost. It's just like I don't like doing those things. And so that's a big part of it. Another example is that Brattleboro is like certainly deeply eligible for federally qualified health center, which is a really like profoundly useful way to draw down significant federal dollars into your healthcare system. FQHCs get much higher Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements than any other healthcare in the state. And so it means that they can get better doctors and do like much lower cost care and all of those things. And we don't have an FQHC because it would seriously infringe on our hospital system, which is barely scraping by. And that's like, and so we have all of these systems that we're trying to prop up. And at the end of the day, like how are folks in Brattleboro going to get healthcare that works for them, right? And how are we going to get the dollars we need from federal care? And probably if you ask most Vermonters, they would rather get their healthcare at a primary care doctor that they know than an FQHC that's going to feel like weird and gross and for poor people. But if anyone had ever gone to the FQHC in Burlington, it's like a lovely and luxurious and community. It's like, it has like a Planned Parenthood vibe, which like for me is like the best vibe that a healthcare facility can have. Sorry for any listeners who have not been to a Planned Parenthood, because it's kind of hard to describe the vibe. So yeah, that's the kind of trade-offs that I'm talking about. I also just like want to name, this is like one area of state policy that I know like less about than most other areas. And so like on some level, I am I have a lot to learn before I think I can like really dig deep on this.
Mhm. But thank you for those
Mhm.
examples, make it a little
Yeah.
more tangible. I appreciate it. Um, I'm going to shift gears if you both don't mind, only in the deference to time. But Doug, you had mentioned during the break an audit that is in the works. I think you've heard back from the commissioner of
Yes,
the
Department of Economic Development. Yes.
yeah. I didn't know what CIP was, so
Nobody does. Emily does, but very few people do. What happened is, as part of the response to the pandemic, there was a massive amount of money that came into Vermont, much more per capita than all but one or two states in the whole country. And we did an audit of a major program from the very beginning. The program actually started in early 2020, called the Economic Recovery Grant Program, hundreds of millions of dollars. And there were a lot of problems with the design and implementation of that program. So about a year later, the administration decided in its wisdom that they'd done all of that, which was intended in the context of the pandemic to help businesses return to something like normalcy. Did you lose money? That was basically the question. When in fact, for a variety of reasons, many businesses, not all, many didn't lose nearly as much as they might have otherwise, because when you don't have to worry about your employees, which was the federal program that helped pay people who weren't working because the governor, like other governors, shut down various aspects of the economy, people were being paid. So if you cut off your labor costs and say you're a restaurant, you don't have to buy food if you're not serving anyone. So anyway, the bottom line is net operating income, not losses compared to last year. As it turned out, a lot of businesses ended the year doing better because of the programs from the state than they did the year before, which made me crazy. Because that money could have been used to serve people who had no way to get money other than work. Anyway, so subsequently, the state said, we think there's a need to help some small number of businesses with capital projects. For example, if you're a widget maker and you know that your competitor, Emily, just bought some new machinery and equipment that's going to make her widget factory much more productive, efficient, and profitable than yours, you have no choice but to either buy that same kind of equipment or give it up. So capital spending in the private sector is just part of the game. It's not something unusual. If you want to succeed, you have to do it if you can. But they decided that there was an unmet need, so they created a program called the Capital Investment Program. And unlike VEGI, which is about creating jobs in theory, this program really didn't require job creation. This is something the agency had been thinking about for some time. We want to have a program like VEGI that doesn't require job creation. So that's what they did. But to the credit of a now retired state senator, Michael Sorotkin, the program included a requirement for an analysis by the economists as to what the return on that investment would be for each of the applicants. It's called the net fiscal impact, and they did it. And the agency hated it because a lot of people would come in and say, well, our overall cost is $5 million. We think between a bank loan and some of our own money, equity, maybe we've got a new partner, whatever, we can cover most of that, but we're just short 500,000. Can you help us? Because it's free money. And the state said yes. But then they would give the application and all the financial stuff to the economists, who would come back and say, sorry, that project is only worth $85,000. That's the likely return to the state on that. And you can justify giving them that much. So needless to say, the agency didn't like that. So the next year, they effectively forced the legislature to give them another $40 million because the CIP was funded with $10 million. But they wanted to expand it. So they got another 40 million, and they got the legislature to agree to get rid of the net fiscal impact requirement. That left the agency free to make very subjective decisions about how much money companies needed to do these projects. And one of the things our audit found is that they gave money to some parties, for-profit and not-for-profit, that had plenty of money on their own.
Mm.
What the agency said is, we asked them to give us out their financial stack, as they call it. How much is your own money? How much is from a bank loan, so forth? And what are you missing? Well, I don't know. How do you know? They made every effort to find all the money necessary to do this project. And furthermore, some of them submitted their financials, which the state required. And in 2 instances, we found that they were nonprofits, as a matter of fact, had very substantial capital in the bank and could easily have paid for that gap in the project on their own. But the agency decided, no, they told us they need it, so we're giving it to them. I mean, this is like a Bill Clinton moment. How do you define need? So that was an unfortunate way that they implemented and administered the program. Another, which is just came up because it occurred to me, some of the projects in the CRRP, the Community Recovery and Rehabilitation, whatever it's called, program, included some affordable housing. Many of the projects, the developers, had some funding from either the Housing Finance Agency or the Housing Conservation Board. And whenever you get money from those guys, there is an affordability obligation at varying levels and for various periods of time. Very important. But there were a number of developers who came in with generally smaller projects who didn't have that kind of money and were not obligated, therefore, by any other funders to focus on affordability. So I had the audit team ask the question of the agency, what requirements in the grant agreements do you have, you, the state, to ensure that these units are affordable? Excuse me. And they said, well, they are required to be affordable until December 31st, 2026. Because that's the end of the reporting date for the feds. After that, market rate. And I don't know, frankly, my head exploded. It's like, what are you talking about? You're giving people free money. Normally, when we do that, we expect a return on that investment that's in the public interest. Mm-hmm. Now, some would say, and some have said, all new housing is good. Well, that might be, but why would we subsidize market rate housing, which by definition makes a profit, unless you're a fool? So that bothered me a lot. And to their credit, in the management response to our audit, that's the one thing that the agency agreed that they had mishandled. But the point now is those grant agreements have been signed. I'm not even sure the state has the authority to go back and say, Emily, remember when we didn't ask you to make those units affordable? Now we want you to. Emily could say, a little late for that. Have a nice day.
Yeah,
fair enough.
It is. And I will push, I think actually so I would never change like core statute around housing appropriations and perpetual affordability. And I think it's a really big mistake that particularly the ADU program is not perpetually affordable. It's just temporarily affordable. However, I actually given the scale of our housing crisis, as long as they're not vacation homes, I really feel like absolutely any new units put on the market are making a difference, even if they're market rate. I really do. It is, at least down here.
It's tough.
It's so tough. And so I that's, if I have to prioritize where money goes, absolutely. But I'm really any unit that goes up is a better unit than a unit that didn't go up.
Well, that may be true, but we're talking about how they're paid for, not that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I and I think that any state dollar should be committed to fully accountable systems. I'm just saying in the grand scheme of things, I'm glad that things were imperfect and housing was built rather than things were imperfect and a venture capital firm bought a factory and then closed it, right?
Well, I disagree.
Less harm done, I guess, is what I would say.
This is the happy hour, and you were sad a little while ago. Now you're happy. I was doing okay, and now I'm sad. So
we have to go cry in our cups once the show's done. But I appreciate you both having this conversation because I think it's always good, even when people don't disagree, to get it all out, even when people do disagree, to get it all out on the table, because that's how things are improved. Sunlight, as we say, is the best disinfectant. Um,
In
and
theory.
in theory. But on that note, we are just about out of time. Doug, what would you like to leave listeners with before we head out?
How do people sign up for your newsletter, Doug?
Yes.
They could send me an email and say, please put me on your distribution list. I'd be happy to do that.
How would someone send you an email?
It's this new technology.
What's your email address, Doug?
It's doug.hoffer@vermont.gov.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Secret trick, Vermonters, if you want to write to someone who works in state government on the sort of administration side, it's just their first name dot their last name at vermont.gov. It's very magical. The legislative email addresses are more complicated, but that nice straightforward little formula really helps.
Thank you very much.
Yes. And actually, you can go to vermont.gov and find the employee database and find most employees' email address through that as well, if you're ever looking for a specific person or department. On that note, Emily, if people want to learn more about you or get in touch, how do they do that?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and you can sign up for my newsletter or send me an email or give me a call. And starting to have a lot more events in October for election season and November for policy development season. So good time to sign up for the newsletter so you can hear about all those fun happenings.
Thank you
And they
very
could
much.
carry a couple boxes when they show up.
Doug Hoffer, State Auditor, Representative Emily Kornheiser, thank you for being here today. Of course, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2, rebroadcasted on Wednesday in the very early mornings. And wherever you want to subscribe to your podcast, you can find us there too. Have a great weekend, everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you, Olga. Good to see you, Emily.
Good to see you, Doug. Thank you.